All right. Well, I'm going to get started. I know we'll still have people, coming in as we go. And again, I love seeing where everyone's from and where you're joining us from. So keep saying hello in the chat. My name is Jessica Juarez Scruggs. I use she, her pronouns. I'm joining today from the stolen lands of the Duwamish people here in Seattle, Washington. I'm so excited to bring you the second installment of the Movement Tools series. It's a training series that will be happening every 3 weeks on Thursdays for the next few months. So now through July. And we are so delighted that the first 3 sessions are co-hosted by our incredible friends at Six Action. And we're going to be diving deep into implementation today. I wanted to start off with a quick reminder. While PCAF and Six Action are 501c4 organizations, we know many of you are representing 501c3 organizations, or you're here in an official capacity. And so we're going to dig deep into a meaty policy discussion today, but we're not going to be engaging in electoral or partisan conversations. So the goal of this training is a little bit of what we wish we had known when we started this work. It's to dive deep into the policies and systems that shape our lives and our communities, and identify the opportunities and the organizing strategies that our movement can use to fight for a country where all of our families can thrive. So as I said, the first 3 sessions, the one today and the following ones on April 7th and April 28th, will focus on implementing laws, particularly the American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill. But we'll also be talking about a lot of other opportunities and other implementation fights that are going on across the country. Each training will include a discussion with some fantastic folks who I'm really excited to introduce to you shortly, but it also will include a treasure trove of materials, resources, links, and helpful tools. You'll get those in a Google folder a few days after the training, and as long with a recording of this webinar. So we're very excited to share all of these amazing tools. And if you are joining from a link that you got from someone else, I really encourage you to actually register. Heejin on our team is going to drop in a link in the chat, and we'll do it a few more times so you don't miss it, but register for the series so you don't miss any of those reminder emails and that great toolbox full of treasures. So I'm so excited to hand over the mic to our moderator today, Gohar Siddiqui, who's our new executive director. We're so excited. This is one of her first events with Progressive Caucus Action Fund since she joined our team. Gohar previously served in leadership roles for progressive members of Congress with a successful record of passing laws to improve the lives of students, immigrants, and families. In addition, she worked on programs to reduce the achievement gaps while serving in the U.S. Department of Education under the Obama administration. For several years, she also worked to resettle refugees and provide social services for immigrants as a leader of a group of nonprofit organizations in New England. So we're so excited to welcome Gohar, and I'm happy to turn the mic over.
Thank you so much, Jess. I am really excited to be here, and I want to tell you a little bit about why before we really get into the meat of this conversation. So years ago, I was working for an immigration and refugee resettlement organization, and we were trying to figure out how to increase the monthly amount that we were getting from the federal government to help our refugees find housing, furnish their homes, really get settled in the US. And I think back then we were only getting about $400. So we decided we're going to put a plan together and increase this per diem monthly amount and really figure out how we can change federal laws to increase this amount for our families. And really, we didn't know where to start. And eventually, with that, at the time it was in person, but help from seminars like this and some tools that we managed to put together, we got the increase many years later. But then we had to figure out how to actually get the money to our families and to our organization. And that is the conversation we're going to have today, that implementation piece after laws are passed. So before we get there, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's been happening in Washington. As Jess said, I recently left the Senate, was there for many years, and I am impressed by the number of bills that have passed in the last few weeks. However, I know that many of us are disappointed that the Build Back Better bill hasn't crossed the finish line and is stuck. So we'll get back to Build Back Better, but just wanted to let you know that we recently passed, the Senate, no longer we, recently passed legislation to reform the post office so that families can get the medications they need on time and all the different ways that we rely on the post office. So that was a pretty big bill that took a long time to pass. And also we saw legislation that's passed on sexual harassment and arbitration. So we're seeing things moving, and we're seeing big budget bills moving. So just a couple of weeks ago, the president signed the omnibus bill. And that is really 12 appropriations bills that have been put together as one, as we call, package on healthcare funding and education funding and funding for different programs on the ground that affect climate change. And so that is huge that we were actually able to pass an omnibus package instead of continuing resolution that would have continued the Trump era budget. Let me just pause here for a minute. So the other piece that I want to highlight is just today, the CPC and the Congressional Black Caucus and Hispanic caucuses have been working on executive actions to lower healthcare, increase wages for workers, protect the environment, increase voting rights, and cancel student debt. And all of this is being done through executive orders, not legislation. So we want to talk today about things that we can do when bills that we have wanted are not passing through Congress. We have other tools that we can use. So the other major piece that for the first time we were able to get done in Congress is congressionally directed spending. This was known as earmarks in the past. And just this year, we were able to create these earmarks for our communities on the ground. There was a moratorium on this practice since 2011, but it was revamped this last year so that the money could go to our communities directly. So there were some restrictions on this where no members of Congress or their families could get benefit from the funding, and only state, county, and local governments and nonprofits could submit requests. And every funding request was published online. This process allowed members of Congress to secure millions in federal funding for projects that our communities fought for and won. So for example, in Michigan, the state was able to get $200 million for things like lead surface line replacements, modernizing water treatment centers, suicide prevention, and affordable housing. So we're going to talk more about earmarks or congressionally directed funding in our May series. But I just wanted to highlight some of these things that are what I call good news on the Hill. And we can talk about implementation today and come back to some of these things later in our series. So when we talk about implementation, what does that really mean? Once a law is passed, often agencies help determine the details of who is eligible for those programs, which programs get funded, and what that really looks like on the ground. Sometimes states decide that, the state agencies, sometimes the federal government decides that, but really it's folks on the ground who need to communicate with their state and federal officials to make sure they get that funding. And I really wanted to use some examples of what this looks like. So in December 2020 and March 2021, Congress allocated more than $45 billion in rental assistance. But 3 months later, barely half of the available funding had been distributed. 20 states had not opened the programs to give out this aid. And those that did, they had all this documentation and paperwork that delayed the applications. And this caused unnecessary delays and resulted in hundreds of thousands of renters being evicted. So really, our work is not done when a law is passed. That is really when the work begins again. And there's so much money at stake right now. I want to talk about the stimulus packages. So that in March 2020, we passed a $2.2 trillion CARES package. The American Rescue Plan was $1.9 trillion, and that passed in 2021 in March. And then there's the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There's $1.2 trillion in there that passed last fall. Now, I'm not going to add all those trillions up, but that is trillions and trillions of dollars that are now being implemented, as we're saying, at the federal and state levels for that funding to actually reach our communities on the ground. And there's a big part for all of you to play in making sure that money gets to your communities. So all those bills I mentioned became law because of every single person who spoke out, who told their stories, who organized their neighbors, called Congress. And it's because those bills passed that we're here to talk about implementation. And that will bring me to my panel. It's my true pleasure to introduce Six Action Fund's co-executive director and our co-host today, Jessie Uluberry. As a career person of color and as a parent and as someone who grew up in a trailer park, Jessie understands the demands the progressive movement makes on our elected officials for radical transformative change. As a former Colorado state senator, he knows how challenging it is to deliver on these needs with little institutional support for public leaders in a system that is designed for slow incremental change. With this dual view, Jessie has dedicated his career to building progressive power from the states outward. So Jessie, as the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure bill is implemented, can you talk a little bit about what is working and what's not working?
Yeah. Well, first, I want to say thanks for co-hosting this series, and it's wonderful to share a virtual space with Councilmember Mosqueda, with Senator Geis and Danielle Atkinson, people who inspire me daily, and the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, a partner in how we build real community power. So as was said, my name is Jessie Uluberry. Pronouns are he, him, or any with respect, said as a two-spirit person, and I'm on the Osage and Shawnee lands, also known as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When we talk about implementation, like, we can get in the weeds of things. And for me, I just want to reflect on the historic nature of this week. We are really 1 week from the anniversary of the passage of the American Rescue Plan. We're also in a week where we're commemorating the Atlanta shootings, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and the demands our movements have made to transform our world. And the ways we transform the world isn't the passage of the bill, right? Whether we're eliminating bans on chokeholds or no-knock warrants, or we're making sure that equal pay day happens and people get the money that they earned, it isn't about the passage of the bill. It's how we actually make those realities felt in our communities, in our families, that people can feel safe, that they can get the money that they earned, or that they can, just live and thrive and not be targeted based on their identity. So I hold the multiple anniversaries of this week central in the conversation about implementation, because that's what we need to focus in on. And so, Gohar, your question was, what is working in states? And I really want to focus here, because when we win state policy, it often comes with significant resource. So we won this huge federal package of benefits, including, deep investments in unemployment insurance and vaccines and making schools more safe, making sure that testing was available, but also direct assistance on things like housing support or food assistance. These deep investments have been the manifestation of progressive movement demands and organizers for decades who said there's a real different way that we can organize to support our communities. So in terms of what's working, this kind of organizing that calls for the boldness of the moment we're in, it clearly can result in changes in policy. And there needs to be a complementary connection to making sure that those policies are really felt. So in terms of what's working, I want to lift up some of the great work that happened through our legislative network. We work with state legislators all across the country. And I just want to remind folks that state legislators usually are part-time, they're unpaid, very rarely have dedicated staff. And so Six Action and our C3 organization Six, we support those state legislators to do their jobs well. But those state legislators have significant authority in appropriating dollars, giving money into communities based on the priorities that were set federally. They come to Six seeking guidance and advice to learn how to seize those moments. So for organizers, I want to be really clear that when those policies passed, many state legislators got to work to making sure that they allocated the resources where they could, and others were more discretionary, meaning that they had the chance to discuss and decide where funds went. So this is an important distinction. What is discretionary and then what is mandated for federal benefits? Things like housing assistance or unemployment insurance, where there's already a vehicle for folks to get those monies. From an organizing perspective, I think it's really important that we focus on that when we win a big policy like this, what works best is that we make sure that the people who need the resource, who need the support, or the changed condition in their lives have access to it. And we saw that when the big package passed, there were all these new benefits, but many people in our communities didn't know how to apply for an extension of unemployment insurance or where to access food assistance or how they might get additional support. By and large, because our bureaucracies are kind of outdated. Sometimes those systems don't talk together. So one of the things that we did at Six that we would encourage folks to think about in implementation is we actually had to popularize the benefits. We are the policy nerds who were there with the bill, so excited about these huge investments in our communities. And a person who's taking their kids to school and going to 2 jobs may not fully understand the benefits. We launched a national digital campaign to highlight that these kinds of benefits were available. Here's the point where you could just go and apply. And I want to speak specifically about a Pennsylvania case study. $7.4 billion in American Rescue Plan dollars went to Pennsylvania. But at the time, the state legislators didn't really have a plan, and they needed to focus on the discretionary money, the places where they were going to make decisions to spend. But at the same time, all of these other benefits were immediately available. So we worked on a targeted campaign, a digital campaign that actually demonstrated to Pennsylvania residents, here's where you apply for housing assistance. Here's how you get food access. Here's what you need to do if you're going to apply for additional tax incentives that came through the American Rescue Plan. And that was an easy thing we were able to do, a simple landing page that helped to redirect folks through the process. But we didn't just do it to connect folks to the benefit. We did it also so we could use those wins to organize for more power. By making sure that folks saw the direct impact, the immediate concrete improvement in their lives, they knew that others were going to be organizing on this effort. And so we worked behind the scenes, working with legislators and movement actors to say, how can we actually think about spending money in Pennsylvania on the discretionary side, right? So we got to connect up these tactics. How do we make sure that we get folks what they need right now? And then how do we move to the part of the work here where we might be able to organize for different plays, get more money into our communities, and really center impacted people in the process. This is one example, but I would love to share more as we go throughout the day.
Great. Thank you so much, Jesse. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda. She serves over 725,000 residents of Seattle. As a longtime community organizer and advocate, her top priorities on the City Council are promoting healthy communities, lifting up working families, and creating more affordable housing for all residents through the city. In 2019, Councilmember Mosqueda was awarded the Local Progress Addie Barkan Progressive Champion Award and was the first-time candidate in the nation to win using publicly financed campaign vouchers. Councilmember Mosqueda is a third-generation Mexican-American, the daughter of educators and activists. She grew up in Olympia, Washington, And some of her earliest memories are being in rallies to protest wars and injustice with her parents and her little sister. So, Council Member Mosqueda, you were a huge advocate for community participation in the creation of the Seattle Rescue Plan. How did you work to build community participation into the creation and execution of your plan?
Thank you so much. It's first wonderful to be here with you. I'm so honored to be part of this panel. It's great to meet you, Gohar, and to see my old friend Jesse and also Jessica. I look forward to hearing from all the panelists today and the community that's on the line. This first is a really unprecedented opportunity for cities. The ability to have American Rescue Plan dollars go directly into cities and thus to have local jurisdictions be able to turn around and invest those dollars into our local communities, but most importantly, into the hands of working families, into the hands of workers and our smallest businesses, really provides city with an unprecedented opportunity to directly infuse cash into our local economy and thus improve the health of individuals and families. This was a critical opportunity for us as cities, especially progressive cities, to respond to the inequities that we knew were present before COVID, but because we're exposed and worsened due to the pandemic, we could actually take dollars and make amends and try to address past historic wrongs with these cash dollars. What we saw before the pandemic was that workers of color, mostly women workers of color, were more likely to work in low-wage jobs and work without health care. And the pandemic hit, and the consequences were and continue to be that folks of color, especially Black and brown workers, especially women workers, are more likely to experience contracting COVID and dying from COVID. Those of us who work in frontline industries were more likely to lose our jobs in retail sectors and hospitality. And those who continued to have to go into work, who kept jobs in low-wage sectors specifically and had to continue to go into work and didn't have a work from home option, were more likely to be workers of color as well. So that put them and their family at risk, and thus again threatened the already unstable health and economic situation and housing situation that many working families were in. We wanted to use these ARPA dollars, the American Rescue Plan Act dollars, to directly infuse cash into those who were most disproportionately impacted by COVID. And thanks to you and our congressional champions, I want to thank our Washington State delegation, especially Representative Jayapal, who worked with us on childcare issues, Senator Murray, who called out and asked she could work with us on housing issues. Our entire delegation, plus all of the advocates, including yourselves on the line, made it possible for us to have funding that could be used as direct cash investments. And that is what the data says. If we can get dollars without conditions into the hands of working families, folks know best how to use those dollars to pay for their most immediate needs. This is the best antidote to generational poverty. If we can make sure that cash assistance is available for those disproportionately impacted by COVID. We thought that that was a possibility with the early release of the bill and some early conversations about rulemaking. And then as you talked about, as the rulemaking progressed and folks, including our Progressive Caucus champions, engaged in rulemaking, it became very clear that not only was it allowed for us to do cash investments, it was something that was encouraged as a way to help address the crisis that COVID had worsened. And the way that we focused our conversation around ARPA was to immediately pull in community members. In March, we started having conversations with other cities and community about coming to panels. And in April of 2021, we had conversations that focused on learning lessons from other cities. So we talked to folks in Denver, Austin, Minneapolis, the local progress leaders in those communities to hear what they were doing with the cash. We also heard in our April meeting directly from community affected by the impacts of COVID. And what we heard was, you need to use these dollars to invest not only in the immediate relief for COVID, like standing up vaccination clinics, making sure that we had testing sites that were actually available in communities of color, but you need to invest in the shadow pandemic, the stress, the trauma, the hardship, the worry that had been created due to the pandemic because of housing instability, because of lack of food access, diaper access, and making sure that folks had mental health services. And that informed what the city of Seattle did. We took those conversations from our April meeting, and we created a resolution to guide us over the next few months so that we could really stay centered on what we heard from community. And we made sure that we centered our conversation, referring back and back and back over to that resolution so we could lift up what community said. They wanted direct cash investments. So we did that. We tried to provide the antidote to the hardship by direct cash investments, and I'll just highlight a few. One is childcare workers, for whom their work, if it wasn't possible, our economies would not run. We invested $3 million into direct cash assistance. That's up to $835 per worker. 3,500 workers received a cash allotment, which we called an appreciation allotment, right before the end of last year. We did $5 million to stand up new childcare facilities because we know, like cities across the country, many childcare facilities are closing and are at risk of never opening. The second thing is we did cash assistance directly to low-income workers, making sure that we focus on those disproportionately impacted by COVID, as the rules said we could do. And of course, that ends up being women, people of color, immigrant and refugee workers. The third thing is small business assistance and nonprofits. The nice part about COVID is that longer timeline for spending dollars. That meant we could build capacity. Capacity building dollars was the number one thing we heard from small businesses and nonprofits. And lastly, $50 million into housing and homelessness services. Yes, direct rent assistance relief, but also importantly, turnkey opportunities to take multifamily structures off of the private market, put them in public hands, turn them into shelter in the immediate, and then long-term affordable housing as we continue to recover from this crisis. This wouldn't have been possible without the direct feedback from community and setting time to hear directly about how folks have been affected, but really most importantly, looking at those underlying inequities in our system and trying to get at that so we never go back to normal and we recover with a more equitable economy for all. It's just the beginning, and I'm really hopeful, as you said, we'll continue to get additional support from Congress to continue to build back better and so much more.
Thank you so much, Council Member. Now I'm delighted to welcome Senator Erica Geis. She is representing Michigan's 6th Senate District, and she serves as the first vice chair of the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus. And also she serves on the Education and Career Readiness, Economic and Small Business Development, Insurance and Banking, Transportation and Infrastructure committees. She previously served 2 terms in the Michigan House of Representatives, and prior to her service in the legislature, Senator Geis worked as an adjunct faculty member and an instructor at multiple universities. She's a small business owner and has an extensive publication history as both an author and editor of nonfiction books and articles. Senator Geis, the pandemic revealed what many working families already knew. Our current system isn't prioritizing them the way that it should. Can you talk a little bit about what the American Rescue Plan funds have made possible in Michigan?
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Gohar. Excuse me, everyone. I'm losing my voice. But the American Rescue Plan dollars were able to be used for education. So our ESSER funds, we were able to, in the state of Michigan, have 121 million go to Great Start Readiness programs. Also towards childcare. I think those were some of the 2 of the areas where working families were so deeply affected, where people didn't have access to childcare, didn't have access to early childcare, and so being able to have those ARP dollars go towards expanding and improving our childcare infrastructure, and also to our early education infrastructure. There were other things such as long-term care facilities, funds to that, funds to hospitals. In Wayne County, which is where the county that I live in and is the most populous county in the state of Michigan, funds that went directly to the county rather than coming through the legislature, were able to help with the county's emergency rental assistance program. So that's something that, and that still is available for residents to be able to access. So those are just a few examples of ways that the ARP funds have been able to be available for residents, for communities, for organizations to be able to sustain our working households, our working families, and make sure that we are providing the type of, and to beat a dead horse, the type of infrastructure that they need in order to survive, in order to, and hopefully thrive, not just survive.
Thank you, Senator Geis. And I know you're losing your voice because you have been speaking so much on behalf of all these important issues. Also from the great state of Michigan, I'm pleased to welcome Danielle Atkinson. She is the executive director and founder of Mothering Justice. She has a lot of experience as a church-based electoral and community organizer. She's worked with organizations such as America Votes, State Voices, Acorn, Population Connection. In 2012, Ms. Atkinson founded Mothering Justice, a leadership development and advocacy organization to raise the minimum wage in both Florida and Michigan. And she's also pushed for paid sick time in Michigan. She fought and earned, she led the fight to get earned paid sick time in Michigan. Her work organizing mothers won her the 2013 Michigan Organizer of the Year Award. And we're really excited to have her here. So I want to get a little bit into how you're approaching this implementation moment as an organizer.
Yeah, first, thanks so much for the invitation. I was a last minute ad and I'm just really appreciative to be on the panel. Jessica asked me and said, you'd be with Erica, and that's my senator. But I've been really enjoying the conversation. Jesse, it just reminds me that, I've heard wonderful things about you and I can't wait to do a one-on-one with you. And Councilwoman, I am inspired by what you have done with the rescue dollars in your community. And really, I've been taking notes on all the things that we can do. I apologize for this weird setting. As we are getting back to normal, I had an opportunity to leave my house and be between meetings again. And so as an organizer, it's an interesting feeling to be doing meetings from my car again. But so I'm in the back seat. But to answer your question, just to piggyback on what so many people have said, it's a very interesting moment that we're in, right? After COVID, we have had victories with the rescue dollars, and they were unexpected. Obviously, there are things that we have been working on for years, but as they come into our community, we have to familiarize ourselves with infrastructures that we haven't necessarily worked with or worked, with in the past. So one example is, as Senator Geis was speaking about the child care dollars, a very big issue for Mothering Justice is a friends and family network. So unlicensed providers, we call them other mothers, and advocating for them, right? They are a very crucial part of childcare infrastructure and part of the childcare world as a whole. And through the pandemic, when our childcare centers were closed, they were really who we relied on. And so to make sure that they are included, you got to be kind of nuanced, right? Because these dollars were not necessarily built with them in mind. So we familiarize ourselves with the administration, which was a friendly administration, talking to the childcare administrators, and just finding ways in which that we can insert them and make sure that they are receiving dollars. Again, really heartened by what the councilwoman has been talking about and what happened in DC with direct payment. So we are looking for avenues in which we can reimburse and directly childcare workers. But I think it's really important to familiarize yourself with the administration. And also, to Jesse's point, we've got to be working with agencies that are used to giving direct services or have a list of direct services, because it's important that our our members and our constituents understand the resources that they are entitled to. We had the opportunity to receive grants from the Women's Bureau, which we've never gotten money from the federal government before, called the FAIR Grant to do exactly that, which is go into the community and speak to people about what they are entitled to with the rescue plan. And so that's a really unique position for an advocacy organizing organization to be in, but really crucial in this time as we are fighting for Build Back Better to pass in whatever form it shall pass. We've got to be familiar with these systems because the same situation is going to be happening again. Also, we need to be familiar with the budget process. That again is not necessarily something that our groups are usually on the ground really working in. So there is probably an agency within your state. You can, they usually are the recipients of the Kids Count money. So if you can Google Kids Count and find the organization in your state that receives those funds, they will be familiar with the budget process and can kind of lead you through that and help figure out ways in which you can be inserted in the process. And then also, Jessica came to us early in the Build Back Better conversation to be like, what are the executive orders? What is your executive order strategy? I'm like, oh shit, I do not have an executive order strategy. But that is I think really crucial for our groups to think about, especially going into an election year. Hopefully not the last 2 years of a Democratic administration, but we should have our minds set that not a lot of work can be done in the next 2 years. If we lose Congress, if we're weakened in some way with this administration, we need to have other avenues in which we pass policies. So those are extremely important. But yeah, I would just say make a coalition of people that understand the budget, that are really great legislators, whether they be on a statewide or a local level, and agencies that are used to direct service distribution, so that you can really work the entire cycle of advocacy to implementation and distribution of funds. That's extremely important. There was one more thing I wanted to say. I can't remember it, but yeah.
Well, you made a lot of really good, important points. And we'll have more time towards the end if you remember what you were going to say, Danielle. So now we're actually going to get into how this federal money gets to our communities. And Alex Samuels from the Progressive Caucus Action Fund, he's our research associate. He's going to go through this presentation for us. But I just want to let you know, he's awesome. He just, before coming to our organization, he served on the Senate Health, Education, and Labor Committee. His master's thesis was working with community organizations and the DC Council to develop policies to combat the city's growing wage theft epidemic. So Alex is going to go into how, once a law is passed, how does the federal money actually trickle down to communities? I'm going to turn it over to Alex.
Thanks. And I think Heejin has some slides. You can put those up. Thank you. So
and these are going to be available in the movement.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. So if folks absolutely can't look at this or take notes right now, these are going to be in the toolbox that we're going to share after this presentation. Go ahead.
So I'm just going to quickly take you all through the major types of implementation processes so we can get back to questions for the panelists. When there's some kind of governmental action, Congress signs a bill, President signs an executive order, an agency makes a determination that something needs to change. Usually that change will happen through one of these three processes. Rules, where an agency will issue a regulation, grants, where agencies administer pots of money, and implementation plans, where agencies instruct states to make their own plans about how the change will be put into practice. I'm going to quickly go over how each of these processes work and name a few places where organizing and advocacy can make a difference. And as Gohar said, we'll be sending around a more in-depth discussion of this, so don't worry about taking notes. We'll start with rulemaking, and I know the text is a little bit small, but we'll send out images you can zoom in on. So you don't need to squint to read the small text boxes. So this is how agencies literally write the rules that govern corporate decision-making, judicial rulings, and other stuff that affects our daily life. There are a few different types of rulemaking processes. I'll be going through the most common one, which is called notice and comment rulemaking. And the process is pretty strict. When an agency wants to issue a rule, they have to post notice in the Federal Register before they start drafting. Then they post their proposed rule, which the White House Office of Management and Budget has to score. Scoring is basically determining the economic impact of the rule. Sometimes the scoring process leaves out big picture factors such as long-term impacts on the climate or benefits of everyone having insurance. Really, the office is really only considering immediate costs, which obviously disadvantages progressive causes because the causes we support reduce inequality and make the world better, which is, kind of hard to quantify. Regardless of the office's procedural shortcomings, by law, it does have to score all rules. The Office of Management and Budget also hosts listening sessions where you can tell the office and a representative from the agency your thoughts on the rule. After all this, the public gets to weigh in. Literally anyone can weigh a comment or anyone can post a comment on a rule in progress, which is, in my opinion, the best part of the rulemaking process. And by law, the agency has to review every single comment that comes in. After they take public comments into consideration, the agency drafts the final rule, which the Office of Management and Budget has to score again. And then they post a notice that the rule is active and it'll go into effect 30 days later. There are three main ways a rule can be overturned. One, Congress can decide it's bad, at which point they have to pass a law saying so. We all know how easy passing laws is. Two, the agency can just say, never mind, and rescind it. This usually happens when a presidential administration changes, but they do still have to go back through the whole process, so it still takes a while. How rules usually die is a court will put a stay on the rule or invalidate it. Generally, though, rules have a lot of staying power, and once one gets through the entire process, it's usually around for good. Okay, on to grants. Hey, Jen. So as I said up top, grants are just a block of money that Congress has to distribute to recipients. There are lots of different kinds of grants. Some are formula grants, which basically give states money based on some sort of quantitative measure. They might be based on population or number of people under the poverty line, stuff like that. Formula grants also frequently have very broad applications. For example, the infrastructure bill set aside money for highway and bridge repair, but many states are using it to build new highways instead, which is not great, but is technically legal. The other main type of grants are competitive grants, which is the process I'm going to talk about here. After Congress decides to issue a grant, the appropriate agency will publish a notice of funds. Interested applicants, usually a state or local government, but they can be private contractors or nonprofits, depending on the grant. Interested applicants submit a proposal to the agency saying what they want to do with the money. The agency looks at all of the proposals and selects the one it thinks are the best, the most feasible, the cheapest, whatever criteria they've decided are make something the best. It'll publish an award notice and everyone has to sign a grant agreement saying, yep, we'll do the things we said we would. And then the agency will give out the money. Usually the recipient then does what they say. Everything's wonderful, people get paid. Ideally, the recipient is reporting whatever they're doing back to the agency. Most grants do have those reporting requirements that the recipient has to be in compliance with. This is basically to make sure that they are, in fact, doing the things they said they would, and the agency is supposed to review those. And that's actually the biggest place for public involvement. Reporting requirements are often public information, so you can help make sure recipients are being held accountable if they're not meeting those obligations. Grants are usually for a specified time period or amount of money, so they have sort of a natural end, at which point we can go apply for another one. And that brings us to our last process, implementation plans. Heejin, can you switch the slides, please? Implementation plans are kind of idiosyncratic. They vary a lot based on the specific requirements that initiated them. the very, very high level overview, keeping in mind that all of these steps are flexible, is that the agency lays out exactly what requirements a state must meet. Then the state announces what process it will undergo in order to develop the plan. Then they'll start drafting and meet with stakeholders, and finally submit the proposal to the agency for approval. That's a really long way of saying the state can do whatever it wants, provided it's within the rules set out by the federal agency. One of the cool things about this is that some states allow for a lot of transparency and a lot of public input. And of course, some states have this all happen in a closed room that no one finds out about. For those of you who are organizers, it's really important then to push the federal agency to require that states have hearings and comment periods during the state's planning development. That'll ensure that your local organizing has the best chance of success. Finally, an interesting note about most implementation plans is that there's a certain amount of ongoing revision. While any changes typically must be approved by a federal agency, it is possible to pressure state governments long-term into changing those plans to make them more equitable. And that's it. I'll turn it back over to the panel to answer your questions. And of course, I'm happy to answer any technical questions about any of these processes.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to turn it over to Jess to do the question and answer session.
Yeah, and I want to encourage everybody, if you have burning questions, please throw them into the chat. I'm sorry, not into the chat, because it's too hard to look at two things at once, into the Q&A box. And we will try to get to as many as we can. We kept a really juicy amount of time so that we can have all of our panelists talking to each other and really helping shape this training to be what you all need it to be. So I want to start out with a question that we got a bunch in advance, because I imagine it's on some of your minds, and I'm going to open it up to the whole of the panel to jump in. Sometimes, frankly, often in a situation where we're governing in the real world, a bill doesn't go as far as we want it to go. When it's not as far as we wanted to go, when it's not that transformational change that we're all pushing for, why is it still important to lean in on implementation?
Can jump in. Great. I've been organizing for the last 20 years, and I've never seen a perfect bill, and I've never seen a bill that couldn't be improved over time. But I have, the benefit of 20 years of experience seeing the way that we've built on previous successes to take something and say, here's something that really does provide an immediate improvement in someone's life right now. And there's more work, of course, we can do, and we continue to do it. And so I think this ability to say, take the wins where we get them, and then identify additional opportunities to organize beyond that window. So as soon as we get the win, there's two things we're doing concurrently, right? We're walking and chewing gum. We are thinking about implementation equitably. How do we make sure that the thing that just passed actually happens for the people it must happen for? That's one big focus. Unfortunately, oftentimes, and I say this with lots of errors under my belt and a lot of other issues, we pass the bill. Now we're just going to fight for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. We actually have to spend enough time on implementation so the thing that we just won becomes reality, right? But the second part that we have to think about is, okay, what did we lose? What's left? And where do we have the power to actually inform that additional work? Or how might we continue to shape our reality so the things that we wanted to win in that one bill can become realities further down the road? So I want to talk about two specific examples about how we take these issues when we lean in on a bill that we weren't happy with. In one instance, right, I want to talk about the infrastructure plan. Big investments in historic infrastructure. There's real need. I live in Pittsburgh where a bridge literally just collapsed. So this is an important thing. Like, I have friends 2 blocks away, like, who no longer can drive on their route to work because it doesn't exist. This is a big win, and it didn't get us all the things that we wanted, particularly around the climate policies and racial justice policies that we need. And yet we have the ability to inform how those dollars get spent further down the road. So legislators in our network organized to send a letter to Mitch McConnell and Senator Capito to really influence how we continue to shape on equity, on climate justice, and our broader priorities. And so states might still have the ability to move on those priorities, even if we didn't win them in the federal package. And so this is where we have to say, hey, oh, we didn't get that thing up there at the federal government, but do we have the power at the state level? Do we have the power to organize across states? Or do cities have the real authority to direct these funds differently and make sure that those priorities don't get lost, right? There's so much organizing work around racial justice, around climate justice, and broader worker justice that we can win at other levels because that's where we have some power. So this is an important aspect of, like, when we're not happy, let's lean into these other areas where we have power. I think the other example I wanted to talk about was around the American Rescue Plan. And really about Build Back Better. We have these bold ideas about paid family leave and paid sick days and making these changes permanent. I say this as someone who lost my paid family bill every single year I was in the Senate in Colorado, and it passed finally, and paid family leave is coming to Colorado. We actually have to build on those losses, right? But when we lose at the federal level, I think a lot of us might have the wind taken out of our sails. There's nothing we can do. We lost it in Build Back Better because it hasn't yet passed. What might we do? Well, fun stuff here. American Rescue Plan actually allows some dollars, and the Department of the Treasury just directed that states can use some of the American Rescue Plan dollars to support paid family leave or paid sick days efforts within states. Some states actually have to go through an accounting process. How might we set up a system to allocate paid sick time, or for like a paid family medical leave insurance program, which operates kind of like unemployment insurance? You actually have to do some technical work to build up the systems and the people that are going to have to implement a program like that. So we have this win that really wasn't about paid leave, right? American Rescue Plan was about making sure that we could return to a different world post-COVID. We're still very much in it, right? But the hope was that we could get back to some semblance of normalcy. And yet, it wasn't about paid leave. It wasn't about paid sick days. There were some temporary accommodations. But this is where we take one of those wins that wasn't connected and we find our organizing path. And so in this instance, places like Maryland are now using some of those American Rescue Plan dollars to say, we're going to seed some money here to do the real nerdy, bureaucratic work of how we're going to set up a system around paid leave. That's a really important part, because you actually got to hire people who are going to administer the program. Right? This is how we build on those wins. Really proud of the kind of organizing work that movement actors, legislators, and the folks who really are, I don't ever disparage a bureaucrat. Someone who works in our public structures is so incredibly important, because they're actually making sure the thing that we work through in policy turns into reality. So that's one way I would encourage folks to think about it.
If I can add, thanks, Jesse. When we don't have those wins as far as we'd like them to go, implementation is still necessary so that later on, when something sunsets, or if folks are looking at how that law, that policy actually worked out, if it hasn't been implemented, if the funds haven't gone to where they need to go, if that policy hasn't actually done any of the things that it was intended to do on paper, there's now the potential for that thing to disappear, or for those dollars to be routed to something else rather than the very thing that that policy or original funding mechanism was designed to do. So I think even when we don't, when we get 90% of what it is that we're seeking to do, we really need to make sure that we're able to make that 90% happen, because then we can say, aha, right, this thing's been successful. Even though it didn't go as far as we wanted it to go, we were still able to do this. And now here's proof that we need that additional missing piece, as well as the next thing to build on, to Jesse's point.
I'll also add to that, to these great comments that have been made. I think that as elected officials, there's a lot of pressure to spend quickly. And I think the nice part about ARPA and the extended timeline here for implementation is that we can spend in a way that is going to be most meaningful. And that means building trust with community who perhaps has been historically harmed by past public investments or divestments. I think about past infrastructure bills that have been used to build freeways through communities of color. Let's use this as an opportunity to reconnect communities, to create social cohesion, to improve our health of our community and our local economies. But I think that there's an opportunity here with the ARPA and the extended timeline to keep eyes on how we're spending the dollars. So we are having quarterly updates from our city budget office to provide us with how those dollars have gone out the door. And in the immediate need, in the immediate term, we're using those dollars for those shovel-ready projects, like buying those multifamily structures, turning it into homelessness shelters. We use some dollars to go directly into the hands of human service providers, right? Our homeless service agencies who hadn't seen a cost of living increase in 10 years, who have 40% turnover for some of the hardest work they do. Let's stabilize that sector, and we use some of our dollars there. We use some of the funding for homelessness diversion and rapid rehousing dollars, right? Those are immediate investments where you will see a certain number of people getting assistance. But I want to keep a focus as well on those longer term investments. You know, we talk about shovel ready, but I think there's a new conversation emerging about shovel worthy. So using those dollars in communities that haven't seen public investment or private investment, frankly, in decades, that are seeing higher rates of displacement, and use those dollars to directly invest into purchasing properties that will be a community add, a public benefit in the long term, to create those turnkey housing affordability options within communities that folks are experiencing displacement, and also make sure that we are creating housing opportunities near transit, using the infrastructure investments, not just for roads and bridges, which as well, Jesse, I'm by a bridge that's been closed for 2 years, the West Seattle Bridge. It's been closed for 2 years because it was about to crumble. We need these investment dollars, absolutely, in roads and bridges and highways, but let's also use it for transit, for bike lanes, for connecting communities so that they can roll and stroll and walk and not have to have a car, which will ultimately allow for us to have healthier communities, greater opportunities to live in our communities where we work and want to live and thrive, and truly connect us all. But that takes time, and we need to allow for time and trust to be built with those communities who have seen divestment in the past, our Black and Brown communities who haven't been able to access as much public funding throughout the past decades and centuries. And we need to remind folks who are watching us and being critical of the use of these dollars that capacity building takes time, and to right these historic wrongs will also take time. But let's keep going, and let's keep working together to make sure that we're showing the massive improvements.
I'll add one quick thing before we move on to the next question. And that is that sometimes in the implementation phase, we'll see that the law is actually not working. And this also goes back to the question, sometimes the bill is not perfect, and sometimes it's just wrong and it's not working on the ground. And we have opportunities to fix that either through executive orders or in must-pass bills. That's going to be our May session, so we'll get into that more. But when bills are not perfect, which, as Jesse said, oftentimes they're not, we have opportunities to fix the pieces, whether it's trying to make the program work better, trying to get more funding, or it's something that we really fought for and Build Back Better that isn't going to get done in this huge bill that's gotten a lot of attention. But there are all these must-pass bills that are good, as we call in Congress, vehicles, good bills that are moving through that we can add those other pieces in, and they have to get through that year. So join us for our May session where we talk about that. And I'll turn it back over to Jess.
Yes, definitely. There's so much more conversation here. And I'm keeping an eye on the time. And I know some people will have to jump off at the hour, but make sure you watch the, if you do have to jump, make sure you watch the training as the video as well, because I want to keep our really rich discussion going. So I'm kind of combining a number of questions I've seen. So I'll try to kind of get a bunch of their aspects in, but wondering what kind of barriers you're seeing around that last mile, kind of how do we actually, what is stopping dollars from getting into the communities where they're most needed or into the hands of our friends and neighbors who are really needing these services. I mean, I think if you look at some really critical and important federal programs, the number of people who qualify versus the number of people who are actually getting those dollars, there's a huge gap there, right? So I'm curious if anyone can reflect on what some of those barriers are and some of the strategies that you've seen either community organizers or state and local government use to close those gaps and really make sure that that funding is actually showing up in people's lives.
I'll jump in with the example of the childcare appreciation allotments. Again, we heard directly from childcare providers themselves about the instability in the childcare sector, which was present before COVID, but obviously became literally deadly for those who weren't able to avoid contracting COVID. And the folks who continued to go to work were people who needed that income, who cared about the work and the kiddos. But we wanted to do something to help stabilize the workers, the workforce, and also the sector for those who rely on childcare. One of the biggest concerns that we heard from childcare providers and even the employers themselves is we cannot be stuck in a process that is a multi-page application that requires us to spend hours signing up for this thing. So directly from childcare providers, we got basically our marching orders. We pulled together multiple tables with our Department of Education and Early Learning, and they said to us, they being the childcare providers, we need a one-page attestation, not an application, a one-page attestation that yes, we'd like to receive these dollars and these dollars will go directly to childcare providers. And that type of application was completely new. For folks who've tried to apply for city funding in the past, this has been a big barrier for them. So a one-page attestation led to over 70% of all of our childcare employers in the city saying, yes, I want this. And it again led to 3,500 workers directly receiving the funding before the end of last year. But them telling us, make it an attestation and follow up with us the next year, follow up with us in a few months to ask how many people got it, who got it, what the demographics were. We're happy to provide that information, but let's ease the burden on the front end to get those dollars directly out. Now we're in the process of trying to get that $5 million out for facilities. And internally, we're having a little bit of a struggle because facilities wasn't supposed to be buying a mini refrigerator or another table. Facilities was actually intended to expand the footprint of childcare centers so that more kiddos could come in. And so we are in the process of finalizing those conversations, but I think directly having the feedback from the childcare providers to tell us how to expand and how to get the funding into the hands of providers has been critical.
Jess, you're on mute.
I was just saying, does anyone else want to weigh in on this question? All right. I think that is such a critical, and I know from having applied for various things myself, how challenging that can be. And it's a huge challenge. Another question that's a little bit similar. I'm wondering if folks can reflect on the ways that they've seen either for our elected officials here, how you've done it, or for our organizers, how you've seen other folks do it, or how you've tried to organize to fight for this sort of thing. How do we really make sure that in the kind of big buckets of funding where it could go and be used for a bunch of different things, how do we make sure that that money is actually the most progressive, the most equitable, the most just serving money? How do we inject justice and equity into those kind of big buckets? What are some of the strategies that folks have seen? I would love to hear reflections on that.
Hey, I don't know.
I see Danielle going.
Danielle, did you want to weigh in?
Oh yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I had to like put the phone up to my ear and I didn't. Okay. So I think to me, this question, it feels like a combination, or the answer at least feels like a combination of the last two, right? So on the front end, we need to be early and often around our values, right? So childcare is about stabilizing the industry, increasing wages, and making it more affordable. You got to say that again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And, like an example of a policy that definitely fell short is a pilot program here in Michigan proposed by Republicans, and I believe is not necessarily in the interest of families, but it can be. I mean, we can use it for good. I'll just explain it. So a childcare program, pilot program here in Michigan, is called TriShare, where 1/3 of the cost of childcare is on the state of Michigan, 1/3 is employers, and 1/3 is for the family. Short term, you know, we are definitely going to utilize it to get childcare to families, but it doesn't stabilize the industry. It doesn't address wages, and it's an employer opt-in. So it's like if you feel like it, you know, you can do it, but you're not obligated to provide the service. And it's a way, really, of corporations unloading costs onto the government. So values around responsible for being a
Danielle, we're losing you a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm like driving now. So I don't know where you lost me, but I just think it's early and often that like,
Losing you again.
okay, I'm gonna stop talking. I'm sure somebody else can say something smarter.
I'm so sad we didn't hear what you had, what the last thing you said, because I'm sure it was wonderful. Does anyone else want to weigh in on this question before we move on? I see hands.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the involvement early and often really helps us get clear on how we can infuse equity at every stage. And for us, it's really important to acknowledge both the history of how our systems were built, a history of anti-Blackness, of anti-indigeneity, systems like Councilmember Mosqueda said, sometimes that were built specifically to harm. And so now we are moving towards a different equitable view of the future. So we have to reckon with that history, because many of these things that we may be grappling with, either the tools of implementation or the actual outcomes of policy, we want to have different outcomes, and specifically anti-racist outcomes, right? Will this policy, will this investment actually reduce disparity, or will it increase it? Is an important question on the front end we need to ask. So one of the ways that we did this, and we'd encourage folks to adopt this framework, is we did a budget primer for state legislators to talk about how to do anti-racist budgeting principles. How might you conceive of different ways you can create a safety net, the ways that you can actually disrupt historic patterns of harm and change the material conditions of folks based on identity. There are differentiated impacts of policy. We have to acknowledge that on the front end. So there's a resource that we will share with folks when the recording is released, which is our anti-racist state budgeting primer. But the other part, and I think this is an important organizing consideration for folks who work in advocacy or policy, there are tools of governance that we can change. So many of the rules or regulations of how state legislatures or city governments work, or even Congress, are literally man-made. And I'm going to make it super gendered because they're hella man-made from our deep legacy of having men control systems. And it means that the outcomes of those systems actually weren't designed to include everyone, right? I want to give a really important example here. In Maine last year, they were the first state in the country to pass a law requiring that any piece of legislation would include a racial impact statement. And that was championed by the assistant majority leader there in Maine, Rachel Talbot Ross, the first Black woman in leadership, right? Seeing, hey, we're actually not having a conversation about how our policies may either eliminate disparity or broaden it. We can actually do something different. For example, in many states, when you pass legislation, you have to know how much is this going to cost and how will that cost increase in the future. Racial impact statements can be something additional that we add on to pieces of legislation. Often when we're organizing, though, we're like, we're just going to go for the thing that we really care about. It's paid sick days, it's family leave, it's additional support for childcare. All of those are incredibly important. Sometimes we ignore what are the structural tools that we can change the conditions of governance, like adding racial impact statements to legislation. So then when legislators are having a real conversation, there's data. We know this will help and this is how it will help, or we know this will cause harm and this is how it will cause harm. Those are two important ways that we can kind of incorporate governance tools into community and power building.
Yeah, I think what what Jesse just said is really important, and we should all be doing this. Or for those who are, an equity lens is also another way. I think we also need to be really cognizant about the donut holes that get created by some policies. So, for example, the very program that Danielle was speaking about has a certain percentage of over the federal poverty line that makes one eligible for this program. But that still means that there are people, families, kids who are left underserved, if served at all. So which means we aren't expanding the base of childcare and access to childcare. And there's a difference between like access and actual ability to utilize it. You know, I think that's the other thing we have to be very cognizant of when we're doing these programs, when we're doing policy, when we're coming up with how ways to implement them. If, you know, if I create something and say, okay, it's over there, but then I don't make it possible for someone to get to over there, like it exists, it's been created, but now I haven't made it so that they can actually utilize it, which then sets up the domino effect of, oh, well, no one's using it, so we don't need to do it. Which I think happens and has happened so often with programs, federally, statewide, across all of our states, even in our local govs, where the policy was created and it just went just enough to be there, to be in existence, to undo whatever the mechanism was that needed to be undoing. But then there wasn't the follow through to make sure that being able to utilize that policy was possible. And we have to be cognizant of that. As for those of us who are lawmakers and policymakers, but also for our residents, the general public, to be aware of these things too, so that they can tell us, like, this thing isn't actually working. Like, can you make it so that it works? And I think that's really important. And with our orgs, our great community organizations as well, to be able to be that voice, because like most people are super busy. They can't be calling their legislators and their council people all the time, 24/7, saying this thing isn't working. So we need our great organizations to be helping with that as well.
I'll just chime in as well on this. I really appreciate those last few comments. You know, I think legislation and passing legislation is not the end goal, right? Just like getting someone elected, there's a lot of organizing that goes into getting someone elected. Just because somebody gets into that seat, your job is not done. Our job as organizers is not done. That is one important element of the larger picture, but the person who gets elected wasn't the goal. The change in the systems, the inequities that are pervasive, the historic wrongs that Jesse spoke to, those are the goals that we're all fighting for. So if we get, whether or not we get someone elected or one piece of legislation signed into law, that's actually not the end goal. The end goal is the systemic changes that we need. And often, you know, we celebrate the passage of legislation or we celebrate someone getting elected because it's important to do so, right? Because it's important to celebrate the work, the blood, sweat, and tears sometimes that goes into that effort to get legislation across that finish line. Because as Jesse noted, these systems, even passing legislation, were not designed for change. In many ways, they're designed to protect the status quo and the status quo of those who were in power when the systems were established. So yes, we should celebrate getting legislation passed. Yes, we should celebrate all that hard work. But the more important step is that then what happens, right? And if it's not a good, final piece of legislation, it's because that's not the final legislation. Whether it's getting progressive revenue passed like we did in early 2020, right when the pandemic was hitting, we passed the most progressive piece of payroll tax legislation called Jumpstart Seattle in Seattle's history. It was 5 times larger than the failed attempt 3 years before, which was a really tragic blow to Seattle and our progressive call for revenue. But that was a stepping stone for that legislation. Now we have the progressive revenue payroll tax. That is a stepping stone towards broader reforms that we need. And I think that the American Rescue Plan Act, as we celebrate it and applaud the impressive and I think historic investments that it's making in our community, is one stepping stone as well towards the broader call for systemic change that we need, that will be Build Back Better, that will be student loan forgiveness, that will be childcare for all, that will be tax reform for these largest corporations. But all of those are not the end goal. They are the stepping stones. And yes, let's celebrate when we get those done and keep working towards that broader vision and ultimate goal.
Absolutely. I'm always an advocate of our movement taking a moment to celebrate and build on those wins. So I want to pull in one question from the Q&A box that's really getting into, you know, the gap between public opinion and legislation. That, you know, there's a lot of really policies that have really strong public support that we have not yet seen actually happen. So the question is about how are we making sure that with public comment and public discourse, how are we making sure that's actually really influencing the policy that's coming down the pike? So I would love to hear thoughts from our elected officials. What are the sort of the comment strategies you've seen that have been most helpful in forming legislation? And for our organizers on the call, what are the strategies that have really worked to influence how a public policy process plays out and make sure that our community's voices are heard? Gohar, I see you with a hand up.
I just wanted to say a little bit about, I don't want to generalize, but in my experience, I think most at the federal level, most members are thinking about three things when they're making decisions on legislation. And that is the timing of that issue, the politics of it, what's happening in their states or districts. And public opinion definitely comes into that. But it also just goes back to voting. They're thinking, the people who have those opinions, are they voting for me? So I think that is a really important question, and I want to hear from the other panelists, but just wanted to set the stage a little bit about how the public opinion goes into those three buckets of maybe how some of them are thinking about which actions they're going to take. And sometimes it's their pet issues. I'll mention that too.
Before I turn to the rest of our panel, I also just want to say, in your toolbox, I realize I've said the toolbox a couple of times, but it's a really great resource. In there are some examples and some reflections from folks who have run past campaigns around rulemaking processes and around implementation processes, reflecting on what are some of the strategies that work to really make sure that public voices were heard. So I encourage you to check out the explainer that is like the written form of the presentation that Alex gave us, with a lot more detail in it, and then the rest of the toolbox, because we do try to highlight some of those moments where change is possible within the process. So with that, I want to see if any of the rest of our panel wants to weigh in. Jesse?
Thanks. I think I want to answer the question that's under this one, or at least the one that I feel might be implied here. For many of us, we're experiencing the acceleration of multiple compounding crises, right? Of a pandemic, of a potential global war, of recession, of longstanding inequities that our families have experienced. And that weighs heavy on us, right? We feel the despair or fatalism of like, will my actions mean anything in a world that is as tough as this? And the stakes are high. I get it. Like, despair and fatalism can feel the easiest path because it's the clearest. But what I would offer is I to combat that myself, I go back to not just hope, but memory of the times where things felt insurmountable in my life, when things felt impossible, and I took one small step, and that one small step started to change the world for me and the people around me. And so in terms of actual comment, part of it is showing up to inform and shape. You might not win on the passage of the bill in 1 year, but you can start to change hearts and minds over the course of multiple years and create the material conditions for improvement. And I say this as someone who grew up in Colorado, a few miles down the road from where Matthew Shepard was killed, and I was terrified of coming out. To fast forwarding 13 years into the future, and I was an openly gay state senator who then won civil unions, who lost on trans identity documents, my last year in session, who then 3 years later, that bill became law, to the point where I'm legally married, and I am married to a man, and we have 2 kids, and I have a grandkid, right? My advocacy, when my voice quivered, when I was terrified to say something in committee, I continued to say it as an advocate, as an organizer, as a person. And so this is where I think we actually have to get exactly to what was added into the chat here. Hope is a discipline. It is actually rooted in the memories of when did we raise our voices, right? So in terms of public comment, in terms of connecting with legislators, just the act will change how others see you, right? Being in deeper relationships, saying, I'm going to raise this particular concern about my own lived experience, about my community, starts to soften and shape people. And I say this as someone who saw my Republican senators, who saw me as like the living incarnate of Satan, right? I had come from labor organizing. I was the policy director at the ACLU, openly gay, brown from a from a trailer park. Like I was like the embodiment of the worst thing that they had ever imagined when I stepped into my chamber. And over time, I was able to change hearts and minds about who I was, what my community needed, because I oriented as an organizer. Organizers, first and foremost, say we must accept the world as it is. That's not saying we have to embrace the world as it is, right? We actually have to know that there are people who disagree with us. We don't have the power where we need it. And we do that initial assessment so then we can change the world, right? How might we build the power? How might we actually change hearts and minds? What coalitions are necessary to push? And so I know this was a question about public comment, but my whole thing is, right, we have to remain hopeful and grounded in our lived memories about when we saw progress on an issue over time. We have a lot of issues that we're dealing with. And the more people show up, the more we invite our friends and neighbors, our community members, the people we love, we build a movement from our homes, not from our home offices, right? That's how we build power, and that's how we win.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that question? That was a beautiful. Okay, Councilmember Mosqueda.
I kind of don't want to, because I think Jesse's last comment is so beautiful and summarizes a motivational speech that we should all remember daily. I would also say from the elected perspective and to my colleagues, and also on my former, in my former life, working with the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO out here as an organizer in that world, what we need is for folks to never sit back and think about that next election. You get into a position because of the folks who elected you and the organizing momentum that got you there. We need folks who are going to be bold, listen to folks, build those connections, but move us forward, because the job that you got was not to sit there and win your next election. The job that you received was the opportunity to make systemic changes, radical systemic changes. And when I say radical, the definition of that word is getting to the root of the problem. Getting to the root of the problem requires public policy and bold public action to undo those historic wrongs. And so if anything, I just came off of an election last November in a very tough political climate out here. But I believe that when you actually take progressive policies and you put them on the top of your to-do list, and you show movement, and that you're not just sitting back and waiting for that next election, that means that the public comment, the organizing momentum, the cry from community to be heard is being seen in your seat, and people are going to want to continue to see that. So just a call for action, especially in this moment where we have unprecedented support from Congress and unprecedented need within our communities that have been hardest hit by COVID and systemic inequities of the past. So take this moment and do what Jesse just outlined. Root yourself in why you wanted to do this work in the past, and never sit back and think about that next election.
Absolutely. And I will say, this is my 20-year anniversary from my first organizing job. It can sometimes feel extremely overwhelming, but if we can hang on to that hope and that disciplined hope, I have seen organized and engaged and fired up communities do incredible things and really move policy hugely at the state and local and national level, and our work is not done, but I really want to like keep us grounded in this feeling of hope that when we actually do organize, when we turn out, when we show up at those public hearings and listening sessions, when we come in with our stories and we come in with our demands really aligned, and we do the work of organizing, it is really possible to create change. And then we build and we build and we build. So thank you so much to everyone on the panel. I know we have, I'm sure there are more questions. I know I have more that we got submitted in advance, but I see that we have 3 minutes left. So I want to just take a moment to, first of all, thank everyone for being here. Thank our incredible panelists. We are so thankful for your time and for all of the work that you are doing. Losing your voices in the fight for justice, Senator Geis. But for all of you, thank you for sharing your experience and wisdom with us, and for being a part of this series. For everyone who stayed on and attended, I know we're all so over Zoom 2+ years into the pandemic. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your amazing questions. You will, like I said, be getting an email from us early next week with the amazing toolkit, with also a forum for feedback. We would love to hear how we can continue to improve. And I really encourage you to sign up for the rest of the series. We've talked about a few of the things we're going to be talking about down the road, but our next session on April 7th is really going to be digging into how we actually go about building equity and justice into policy systems. What does that actually look like, and the nuts and bolts. And then we're going to be talking about what are the opportunities that are still on the table in implementation. That's on April 28th. I'm not going to go through the rest of the month. You can see it in the sign up, but we will be talking about must-pass bills. We'll be talking about executive actions. We'll be talking about what in the heck has happened with the courts in late June. So tune in for that one. I'm sure it will be informative. I was going to say exciting, but I don't think it's going to be exciting, but we're going to have a lot of work to do. So anyway, we are so thankful for all of you for joining us. And the toolkit really is designed to give you further reading, examples from past campaigns, examples from past organizers, policy documents to really help ground you in the moment and find those opportunities that we have. They're on the table. We need to seize them and make sure we deliver as much as we can for our communities. So the toolkit link is not out yet. Caitlin, I see your question. It's going to be in your inbox. So if you're here, I see a few people who are signed up as event participant. That means you clicked on a link in an email, which is awesome. For folks who are sort of in our close circle, but it means you're not actually registered, which means I don't have your email. So if you are here as an event participant and not actually with your name, make sure you go in, and Heejin, would you drop the link in the chat for people? Go into that, click that link, sign up so we have your email, and make sure you get the recording of this with captions, as well as all of the great tools that we have assembled. So please keep signing in. We're so thankful to be in conversation with all of you, and to be sharing this space with you. We are so grateful for all of the work that you are doing across the country. It is so incredibly important. And even when things seem very, very dark, the work that we are doing to hold each other and build hope together and keep building toward a just future is the work of the moment. And we are so grateful for all of you for doing it. So keep an eye on your email inbox. Please let us know how we can continue to improve these sessions. And we are just so thankful for all of you and all of our panelists for joining us. And please join us next time on April 7th.